Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session titled Promoting NGO Media Partnerships Reporting about Human Trafficking. My name is Paola Condemaita, and I'm a project manager at journalismfund.eu, and I'm in charge of our Modern Slavery Unveiled grant program. At Journalist Fund, we are dedicated to advancing independent and investigative journalism across Europe that serves the public interest, furthers accountability as well as transparency, and contributes to critical thinking and well-informed debate. This webinar has been organized by Journalism Fund in collaboration with La Strada International. La Strada International is a European NGO platform against human trafficking that works from a human rights perspective in support of trafficked persons. The platform aims to prevent human trafficking and to protect and realize trafficked persons' rights. Okay, so today we will be discussing how NGOs and investigative journalists can form more efficient partnerships while respecting the independence of journalists. And we will be featuring Suzanne Hoff and Merel Brouwer from La Strada International, Marija Andjelkovic from Astra, Sasa Dragojlo, a journalist from Bern, and Lam Lee, independent Vietnamese journalist. You can expect each speaker to have the floor for about 15 minutes, and we will conduct a short questions and answers sessions at the end of the 5 presentations. And if you have any questions during the webinar, please type them into the chat window and we will address them during the questions and answers moment. If the speaker has some time left during his or her presentation, we will use this time to already answer some of the questions that you will be sharing with us, okay? By the end of our time today, we hope you feel you have more tools to report about human trafficking. This webinar is part of the training program of the Modern Slavery Unveiled grant program of Journalism Fund. Of course, apart from these kind of sessions, webinars that we also offer a grant program that I will maybe explain you a little bit more about it because it's more focused on cross-border teams of professional journalists that can apply for a grant to cover expenses or working time to investigate, document, and expose aspects and cases of forced labor, cross-continental trafficking, and other issues related to the exploitation of Asian victims in Europe. Also, we would like to inform you that at the end of the questions and answers, we will share with you a QR code that will direct you to a survey. And we will send you the link via the chat too. This is not mandatory, of course, but it will help us to organize more trainings that can encourage more investigations in the framework of human trafficking. Having said this, we would also like to know from where you are following this webinar. So right now we are sharing a question on your screen and you can tell us from which continent you are connecting to. So I will ask my colleague, Marie, to share with you this poll and you can let us know from where you are following this webinar. For us, it's always important to know where and which places we can reach through this kind of online meetings that we know that are very useful. Even if you are not living in Europe or Asia, I'm sure these kind of cases of human trafficking happen around the world. So it's a sad situation, but at the same time, I think we can join forces to report about this and to make the public aware about what's happening around us. So we will give some seconds to our attendees and we will see from where they are connecting. And then also I will try to read some of the chat. Well, I see someone is from South Africa, Gothenburg, Sweden. Welcome, Lola. Thank you for connecting. Ukraine as well. Thank you. And yeah, we will get some minutes and then I think we can close it already, Marie, and we can see from where they are. Okay, many people from Europe. Thank you. From Asia as well, welcome people from Africa and North America. Thank you so much. And we will be also recording this session, as I said, and then maybe people who were not able to be live now to connect at this moment, they can see this webinar later on, okay? And yeah, we will start our webinar with Merel Brouwer from Lestrade International, who will be speaking about the legal framework journalists should know about before reporting human trafficking cases. She is a researcher and project manager at Lestrade, and she has a master in Dutch criminal law from the University of Amsterdam and a master on international criminal law from the University of Amsterdam and Columbia University School of Law. So, Merel, the floor is yours, and yeah, we give you this time.
Thank you, Paula. Good afternoon, everyone. Hello, I am Merel Brouwer from Lestrade International. And in this presentation, I will tell you something about human trafficking, about the legal definition, and about how to and how not to report about it. I will first make some introductory observations about what we see nowadays when we look at reporting about human trafficking. And after that, I will go into the legal definitions, both of human trafficking and related crimes such as forced labor. Later in this webinar, my colleague Suzanne Hoff will go into some further topics, including stereotypes and ethics, dilemmas for NGOs, and recommendations. Oh, excuse me. So we will start with what we see in reporting about human trafficking nowadays. Well, generally what we see is that there's quite some interest from the media about human trafficking. And also the media has an important role to inform the population, but there are also some downsides and some challenges. Firstly, we see there is a major focus on sexual exploitation as it sells. Stories very often focus on female victims, describing where, by whom, and how they were sexually exploited, as well as the arrest and trial of the perpetrators. And covering trafficking cases in this way is very problematic, as it further embeds the stereotypes and legitimizes the dominant, though very incorrect view that human trafficking as a crime only affects women in sex trade. This brings me to my second point, the heavy reliance on sensational stories, which we see. Many journalists try to trace and find a high level of detail about anything which might shock or outrage the reader. And rarely do we see articles about what really happens to the victim. For example, did he or she receive the necessary mental and legal support? And did law enforcement treat him or her in the way they should, namely as a victim or a potential victim of human trafficking who has to be protected against secondary victimization? Or was he or she merely treated as a source of information for the investigation? These are all very interesting points. We don't see that often, so I thought it would be a good thing to think about. That brings me to my third point, the strong interest to speak with the victim. This is something we see, that a journalist often want to really speak with a victim, have an interview, but is it really in the best interest of the victim? Have you thought about the secondary victimizations, the risks which there are? My colleague Suzanne Hoff will touch upon this later in this webinar. Then the last point on this slide, information in articles is not always correct and not always well checked. Well, as a journalist, you have limited time, limited resources, and limited knowledge about all the specific subjects you write about. So this poses a challenge, and we could think about the possibility of an opportunity for cooperation with NGOs here. So as you might understand, all these points pose some dilemmas for NGOs to work with the media. This brings me to the second part of the presentation, the legal definition. We start with human trafficking. Well, what is human trafficking? It's a very complex crime, and it includes different kinds of exploitation. It includes human trafficking for the purpose of labor exploitation, for example, in agriculture or in construction. Human trafficking for the purpose of sexual exploitation. Human trafficking for the purpose of criminal exploitation, for example, forced pickpocketing or forced work on a cannabis farm, as well as human trafficking for the purpose of organ removal. The definition of human trafficking is laid down in the UN Palermo Protocol. And to understand this complex crime, one can best look at the three elements of the definition. Firstly, there is the activities. These include each phase of the trafficking cycle, and also especially the activities before the actual exploitation takes place, namely, for example, recruitment, transportation, or transfer. Secondly, the means have to be proven. These include threat or use of force, deception, abduction, but also more less visible forms of coercion, such as abuse of power or abuse of a position of vulnerability. And lastly, the purpose of exploitation needs to be proven. So to conclude this, three elements need to be proven. For example, there is recruitment through the use of force with the purpose of exploitation. One has to realize that it's very hard to prove this. And in many situations, it might even be impossible to prove this in court. So many cases of exploitation, of human trafficking, or of possible exploitation, the exploiter might never be convicted as a trafficker in court. This does not have to mean that no exploitation took place. This brings us to the next slide, the definition of forced labor and further important terms. So firstly, forced labor. The internationally recognized definition of forced or compulsory labor can be found in the Forced Labor Convention of the International Labour Organization. Forced or compulsory labor includes all work or service which is exacted from any person under the menace of any penalty and for which the said person has not offered himself voluntarily. It is important to realize that offered voluntarily is to include the worker's freedom to leave the employment at any time. And the definition should thus be applied broadly, including situations in which the person cannot freely leave the job. That brings me to my second point on this slide, human trafficking for labor exploitation versus forced labor. These two sound very similar. Do they overlap? What is the difference? Firstly, they do overlap. Human trafficking for labor exploitation falls within the definition of forced labor. In many cases, human trafficking for labor exploitation is harder to prove, it's narrower, and falls within a bigger framework, which would be forced labor. There's another difference, which is that, as we have seen, human trafficking includes the phases before the exploitation takes place, such as transfer and recruitment. This is not the case for the definition of forced labor. My next point. From strict legal definitions to recognizing a continuum of exploitation. It is important to recognize that these forms of exploitation are not just a strict legal definition. They're not static. When does work evolve into a form of forced labor, and under what conditions can this be considered to fall within the scope of human trafficking? Exploitation should be understood as a process, not as a static relationship between the worker and the employer. The vulnerability of workers often increases over time as they are pressured to repay their debt or when they face threat. That means that a situation can be in the beginning not a situation of forced labor, but it can evolve into one, and it can also evolve into a situation of human trafficking for labor exploitation. Then, what is modern slavery? Modern slavery is a term often heard, but this is an umbrella term used for exploitative practices which happen nowadays. But be careful, because this term in nearly all countries is not a legal term. such as the terms such as human trafficking, as explained just before. Exceptions are the UK and Australia. In these countries, modern slavery is a legal term. Then my very last point, human smuggling versus human trafficking. Two very different crimes. These two crimes are often confused, but it's very important to understand the difference. Human trafficking, as we have seen, is the exploitation of a person for the purpose of labor exploitation, for sexual exploitation, or for criminal exploitation. While human smuggling is something completely different. This is the business of transporting people illegally across an international border. While human trafficking is a crime against the individual victim who is exploited, human smuggling is a crime against the state. Thank you. This was my short presentation. I'm very happy to answer questions at the end of this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Merel. Thank you for your intervention, and thank you for sharing us this legal framework that we consider that it's very important for journalists, especially if you don't have too much experience reporting about human trafficking. I think this can be a good starting point for everyone. So thank you for your intervention. And then, well, we have received a question that maybe since we have some time left for you, maybe you can answer already. And this is exactly and dedicated to you. It says to Merel, what was the geographical focus of your research about media coverage of human trafficking that helped you arrive at the conclusions about these coverage problems? European, Asia, African coverage?
I think this is more the general things we see as an organization, La Strada International. And we mainly work in Europe with both EU countries and non-EU countries, but we also do projects in which we work with third country nationals from Asia, so victims from Asia who might be exploited in Europe. So I might, I think that's what I can say. It's more some general things which we see. And I think if you would want to have some more specific points, I think my colleague Suzanne Hoff might already tell these in her presentation at the end. And otherwise, she would be very happy to answer it at the end of the webinar.
Thank you, Merel. And now we will move on to our next speaker. She's Marija Andjelkovic, is the founder and director of the Serbian NGO Astra Anti-Trafficking Action, which is supported by the UN Trust Fund to End Violence Against Women. NGO Astra provides direct assistance to survivors of trafficking and works with the government to advocate for better policies. She will be speaking about how Astra collaborated with journalists, and she will share useful tips for NGOs for their relation with media. So now the time is yours, Marija.
Thank you, Paula. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Marija Andjelkovic. I'm coming from NGO Astra Anti-Trafficking Action from Belgrade. We are based in Serbia. Very shortly, I will present what Astra actually is doing. We were founded in 2000, and we have a very holistic approach to the issue of trafficking in human beings. We do a lot of prevention, education, and campaigns, awareness-raising campaigns on trafficking. We provide assistance, direct assistance to victims of trafficking, and we have SOS hotline for victims. We provide medical, legal, psychological, and support during reintegration process. We also do a lot of monitoring of the policies and reporting and shadow reporting on trafficking. And thanks to the direct victim assistance program, we can see what's going on in the field, what are the trends, so we can adjust and plan our activities and programs. And policy and advocacy work, like introducing lobbying for the new laws, improving national referral mechanism, doing advocacy campaigns for compensation for victims, a national rapporteur that we recently managed to introduce in Serbia. Also, we did a lot on non-punishment implementation closer in Serbia, and improvement of services and support to victims. We also run a NGO network of anti-trafficking network in Serbia, and we are members of La Strada and GW Worldwide Network for combating trafficking. And in Serbia, we realized very soon that at the very beginning that we are talking here about organized crime. So we connected with partners in Serbia and outside of Serbia. And also, when I say partners, I mean also media and journalists, which are very important partners. And also we have a partnership with professionals, like we created a network of 20 therapists which are working on victims' trauma, and 25 lawyers which are providing legal support to the victims. Now it's something is blocked. Yes. So until today, we received almost 52,000 calls at our SOS hotline for trafficking, and we supported 562 victims of trafficking. Majority are women and girls who are sexually exploited, but we have more and more men who are victims of labor exploitation, mostly, and the total number of children in the total number of victims, actually 32%. So trends in Serbia are changing from year to year. When Astra started to work, the majority of the victims we were facing were coming from Moldova, Russia, Ukraine, Bulgaria, Romania, and they were victims of sexual exploitation. They were mostly in transit through Serbia, ending up in Western Europe or the US. But nowadays we are witnessing increased number of victims of domestic victims of trafficking, internally trafficked, which means within the borders of Serbia, which doesn't mean that we don't have international trafficking. It's just not so easy to see it, since we have visa liberalization. Also, some of the new trends are that traffickers are changing their modus operandi. So, for example, in the beginning, we had a lot of cases of victims with bruises, no teeth, cigars all over the body. But nowadays we have seen that traffickers are changing their modus operandi, so they are more sophisticated. They're learning also, like us, so they are using more other ways of controlling the victims, like blackmailing, that they will put their photos on the social networks or send to the families, or blackmailing with the family or a child. They are doing more like psychological control of a victim than physical control of a victim. Also, we recently we saw more and more cases, and probably we will see more of massive labor exploitation cases, and I will talk more about it later. Like recently we had Linglong case, and before that case of Indian workers, Chinese workers, Turkish workers, and now already famous Serbas case that resulted with a European court judgment last year. Regarding COVID, I know it's boring to talk about COVID now, but just one sentence, that during the COVID, we had increased the number of calls at our SOS hotline for 130%, and number of field actions for 44%. I'm talking about Astra staff, 44% more of field actions than we used before the COVID. The only reason for that is that the institutions who were supposed to provide assistance to victims didn't work at that time. Now I will come closer to Astra relationship and NGO relationship to media and journalists. Very at the beginning in 2003, we published our first manual for journalists. And later we had a second edition. I will send you links in the chat room later. And So in 2002, we published the first edition. In 2009, second edition. We did it together with our colleagues, journalists. We gave some tips how to talk with the victim, how to avoid some mistakes, how to partner with the NGO, and so on. And also, very soon after publishing this manual, we start with the trainings for journalists on trafficking. But very soon we gave up of the idea when we realized how the media in Serbia actually are working. So we focused on mostly on journalists who are investigative journalists, and at least I'm talking for Serbia, not for the region or worldwide. So it was obvious that even we have a good journalist and he or she understood what we are talking about and ethics and everything, the final voice will be given by the editors, actually, who will put some sexy title or a name of a victim in the article, and that's it. So that's why we have more now individual relation to certain journalists. Also, media are very important for our work. So that is why we start we did a lot of media campaigns. But why? Not to promote Astra as an NGO, but to promote our SOS hotline. Media actually is the only way how to reach potential or real victims of trafficking. And we did a lot of media campaigns and how important they are. I will show you now, for example, after this campaign, this was a very famous campaign. After this campaign, our increase of our calls at our SOS hotline and number of victims increased. So also some new statistics is, for example, in 2001, last year, we had a campaign. In 2020, we didn't. So in 2020, we had in total 158 articles on trafficking in our Serbian media. And after the campaign in 2021, you can see it's almost 5 times more, which directly leads us to more people who saw the number, SOS number, and more victims and relatives and families and people who called the SOS hotline, and then more increased number of identified victims. Because when you see the small number of victims, it doesn't mean that trafficking disappeared. It only means that the dark number is higher. So we need to reach actually victims in the dark number. We did a little analysis why media is how media and why they're reporting actually, and as you can see, in 80% of cases regarding trafficking, they report about the event, and in only 3% they talk and write about phenomena itself. So I would definitely agree with the colleague who spoke first from Ostrada about how it is important, the way how you're going to report, and about the concrete trafficking case and trafficking in general as a phenomenon. Why media is important? Probably you know this better than me, but just to put it in one slide, media is informing public, they're raising public awareness. For us, it's really important because media and journalists can detect the trafficking cases. For example, the last case this massive labor exploitation case, Linglong case in Serbia, was detected by the journalist. And also, it is really important for us as an NGOs that the media can discover the background of the case, because we as an NGO we are focusing on the victims and the policies, but sometimes we have limits. Our limitation is like well-being of a victim. But sometimes behind the victim story, there is a much bigger story, because victim is only one puzzle in the whole picture. So this is where media can play a great role and discover the case. And just to give you an example, in the Serbas case that resulted with European Court for Human Rights judgment last year, Astra was the one who was supporting the victims in that case, and Astra published the report on the case with the details that we learned from the victims. But actually, journalists from OCCRP network discovered the whole story behind and the corruption chain with the high official governments in the country. So I will also send you that link so you can see it is presented in 3 short movies, the whole case. And this is something that we didn't know from the very beginning when we start to wait for the victims to come from Azerbaijan to Serbia and to collect their stories and to provide them medical, legal, and other types of support. And also media is important because of the visibility of the topic and problem, and also to point out the positive examples, how some things can be solved in trafficking. I think that partnership between NGOs in media, the real media and the real NGOs, because on both sides you have gongos and also media who are maybe closer to governments, so they won't write about these cases. I think it's crucial, and I have so many examples from I'm in Astra for the last 2 years. I have so many examples how good partnership between a journalist and an NGO can result with a really positive effects at the end. And concretely, for example, with Sasha, who will speak after, we worked together on the Indian workers case and also Linglong case. And sometimes we need this puzzle also on our side. You know, when victim is telling us the story, we are trying to build a case in the court, for example. We miss that one piece of information, you know, to have the complete picture. And on the other side, we know that journalists can collect so many information, but they don't publish all because sometimes they need to double check or something. So this exchange of information is sometimes really crucial for the case in the court, or for the justice at last, or for the victim herself. Going more deeply to the labor exploitation case, which we call it new old trend. The first case of labor exploitation Astra had in 2006, and that was the individual case of labor exploitation of one young engineer from Serbia on the construction site of Malta. He managed to escape, but unfortunately not to bring the case to the court. And all other cases after that one were actually massive cases that we had, like those I mentioned: Serbia in 2009, China case in 2019, India 19 and 20, Turkey case in 20, and Vietnam case in 21. And there were more, but actually these were the cases that Astra were involved. Most of these labor exploitation cases happened in the field of construction work, infrastructure, state-supported projects, agriculture, car industry, and so on. All these, as I said, cases were state-supported infrastructure project cases involving corruption and high lucrative interest. So corruption on a high level and high lucrative interest of individuals, of groups who were close to the government. In majority of the labor exploitation cases, we have male victims, which is something different that we used to have before. Actually, now they are more visible, but then we also, as an NGO, need to adjust our services, you know, to the male victims, because in Serbia we didn't have and we still don't have a shelter for male victims of trafficking, or some types of assistance. Even terminology we need to adjust, because, you know, men from Balkans, they don't want to be called victims. So we even need to change that when we talk to them, because how they would explain to their family they went somewhere in Azerbaijan to earn money and to feed their families, and now you tell them that they are victims. But when you talk to them, they exactly mention the same. They want the same what victims of sexual exploitation, for example, want, and that is justice. They want their money, they want their payments, they want this guy in a prison. They want to prevent other people to end up like them, and so on. Also, the assistance in these cases is really difficult due to the fact that we are talking about massive cases. So Serbia's case, for example, had 900 to 1,200 people involved. In Linglong case, around 400 workers. So it's really hard, for example, to go to the airport for an NGO like of 10 or 20 people to go to the airport and wait for 500 or 600 people, coming every day in dozens. And also to provide medical assistance to so many people and so on. Also, it's interesting, in all these cases, we have recruiting agencies who were in relation between the source country and the destination country, and in relation with the main employer. In all these cases are ignored by the state institutions like inspection, police, prosecution, ombudsman, and other relevant institutions. Either the case is ignored by them, or there were no proper reaction from these institutions. Also in Serbia, like in many countries in the region, we don't have supply chain responsibility, like for example in the US or Western Europe. Some countries had a good practice of this. So these companies actually use this very hole in the law. So, for example, in Linglog case, you have the main company, and then you have a sub company registered also in China and Serbia, who is in charge for recruitment of workers from Vietnam, for example, in this particular case. And then when case happen, the Linglongs say we don't have nothing to do with these workers because we were not the one who engaged them. And then our government say, you see, Linglong has nothing to do with it. So this is something that wouldn't be so easy to say in some other countries. So we need to improve also our legislation in this manner. And also, because there were no reactions and proper reactions, we also didn't have reactions from the prosecution. Actually, in Serbia, we almost never have reaction from prosecution, but also we don't have court case and decision. But what we had in this Linglong case, we managed to draw a huge attention from the international community. So we have a European Parliament resolution on this case. We have a special rapporteur on trafficking, slavery, and others reaction to this, and waiting for the Serbian answer. We also have direct recommendation directly related to this Linglong case from the UN ECOSOC committee from last month. So we will see if the Serbia will react to this. Also, some common points regarding these labor exploitation cases are the workers are mostly recruited from the Far and Near East. Coercion about the job conditions is different from actually, they've been told one thing, and then working conditions and living conditions were completely, including salaries and so on, completely different. Also, they have limited freedom of movement, so they are surrounded by the wire in these camps, actually. And the exploitation is really heavy in these cases, and also threats if they start a strike or to complain that something will happen to them if they complain. And as I said, the role of government in all these cases is really huge, because we are talking about capital investments, and these projects are paid from the state budget. I will just briefly.
You have 1 minute left.
Okay, this is, I think, two more slides I have. Very briefly, in Linglong case, we have we identify out of 67 ILO indicators, 42 indicators of trafficking, and we will publish our final report on this case in 10 days. I'll be happy to share it with you. And now, just to go back to victims, why victims want to talk to media. This is what victims tell to us. I want to warn people. I'm desperate that no one is doing anything. I want to help other victims. to know that they are not the only one, and I want revenge. So this is what you need to have in mind when you want to talk to a victim about their motivation, actually why they want to talk to you. And how the interview with the victim can influence the victim herself. First, it could influence, of course, investigation or court procedure, because we had cases that the whole interview with the victim end up in the newspaper during the court procedure, which completely influence her life in future and the court proceedings. But also it could influence her recovery, integration, and also their psychological effects like reviled traumatic experience, secondary victimization, shame and guilt, depression, and so on. Here, I just listed some tips how you can avoid mistakes. Maybe they look simple, but they are pretty much explained in the manual. So it's really necessary to protect your source of information and her identity. It's important to seek the authorization from the victim about the story, to have written procedures, not only to be sure that you show that, but that she can understand actually what are the procedures and what will you do with her story later. It's important to listen, not to judge. This is something that victims are really afraid of. Do not insist immediately in the first talk about all details because of post-traumatic stress disorder, but maybe to wait for another moment to find, or to use some other sources to find necessary information you need. Then it's important to keep in mind the whole case, the whole picture, not only to rely on the victim story, and of course to be present, to have trust and respect when you talk to a victim. This is really, now this is really the end. Just keep in mind, this is a sentence that one victim told us when we told her that we can help her. She said, I didn't know who to trust, so I ended up as a slave. Actually, she was trafficked by her aunt. Now, in order to be free and to get help, I need to trust all of you complete strangers. So this is, for me, really important that journalists can also remember that you are strangers for this, for the victim. So when you talk to her, keep in mind that the known is always less scary than unknown. And I'm here and open to all your questions if you have. And I will share now the links that I promised. Thank you.
Thank you, Marija. Thank you so much for sharing your work and the work of Astra, of course, during all these years in the framework of human trafficking. And one of the works that they did lately was in collaboration with with two journalists in Serbia, and it was about the mistreatment of Vietnamese workers in Serbia. So that's why I would like now to invite Sasa Dragojlo. He is a Serbian journalist. He has also worked for Insider and the Serbian investigative media portal and a television show in Belgrade. During his journalist career, Sasha has published articles in Serbian and regional media, such as the investigative portal Krik, Weekly Snin and Vreme, Daily Danas, the fact-check portal Istinomer, Vice Serbia, Kosovo 2.0, and others. So, Sasha, this is your time, and you can tell us more about your journalistic work on human trafficking.
Thank you, Paula. Let me just share the screen. Okay, so my name is Sasha, and I am for years interested in this kind of topics. So that is the first thing I would like to mention. Just a second to put this. Just a second.
At the bottom, you have the option to put it in presentation mode.
It was fine till now. Just a second.
No problem. In the meantime, I can share with all of you one of the reports that Sasha, together with her colleague Ivana Jeremic, they did. So I'm gonna put it in the chat so you can have a look on that. And yeah, well, Sasha has been researching about human trafficking for a long time, and today he's gonna share us about his work and the work he did in collaboration with us.
Okay.
Now it's working? Yes.
Yeah, now it works. Okay, so I wanted to tell that in order to deal with this kind of topics, you really need to follow these topics for a long time, because this topic in general in Serbia, but I think everywhere, is not really popular. Journalists often think that labor exploitation topics are not so interested, only as previous speakers said, only when it's something sensational and which is good for the clicks. So the reason I'm dealing with these topics is one of them is just because I don't think it's well covered in the media, and I think it's a really important topic that tells the world more than just the cases, the individual cases. So my commitment to this kind of topics has helped to establish a trust and some kind of authority in these topics, so that people can approach me with these kind of stories, including the workers, the unions, and the NGOs themselves. This is the when we talk about the cooperation of journalists and NGOs, I think that mutual transparency and trust is the most important thing. I have collaborated with Astra, as mentioned by Marija, in several cases, which I will talk a little bit more detailed later. But for starters, I would just say that journalists need to respect their ethics code they generally do for other topics. Also, because we know that there are victims, concrete people involved here, protection of sources and confidentiality is the most important thing. And we should not forget that they are not just sources, but probably the victims. So not to forget that aspect, and many journalists are just instrumentalizing the victims in order to publish a story which is completely wrong and not by any code. Also, why journalists need NGOs? Well, NGOs are on the ground, and they have a mandate to investigate these cases, to protect the victims, and also they are in touch with them. So they can always inform the journalist if something's going on. Also, NGOs as Astra and some other are having an expertise in this kind of field. So even if the journalist can collect some evidences in this kind of cases, when it comes to the interpretation, what is labor exploitation, what is forced labor or human trafficking, you need an expert in the field so he can confirm your findings or deny them in a way. That way you're safe with the information you have. As we all know, journalists are not the experts in all the fields, but they're gathering the expertise of other people, so in order to tell a proper story. Also, NGOs need journalists because journalists are also can be at the source of information, which happened to me several times. Then I called the NGOs so they can help me because of their experience in the cases, so we can do it professionally and with the proper interpretation. Also, media can paint a bigger picture or explain a context when it comes to relations between the certain actors, such as companies, state, or some other intermediaries in the business. And also media have a larger impact when it comes to the public and wider audience. Biasness and objectivity is, I think, one of the also important things that needs to be addressed. Both NGOs and journalists are looking to be objective as possible, but NGOs have a mandate to help the victims. So that puts them in a bit different perspective, while journalists are supposed to be impartial and just tell the story as it is. So I think that this collaboration between NGOs and journalists is good also for mutual fact-checking, because journalists are supposed to ask some questions which are not look really polite, even with its associates such as NGOs. So we to play like a devil's advocate role in order to pinpoint all the facts. Also, journalists have an experience for telling a story in order to be accepted by the wider audience and to have a better narrative strategy, because people who are experts often cannot tell it the way it should be told. But on the other hand, NGOs have that expertise and can pinpoint to a certain angle of the story to give a journalist a lead in a way, so he can map all the problematic things in a proper way. I think the goal, it's important to talk about the goals, because journalists are supposed to work in the public interest. The NGOs and journalists are having a bit different angles. Journalists should raise awareness, and NGOs are campaigning for the problem and for the victims on the ground. So I think the journalistic work is having more impact on the long run when journalists are not acting as activists, because in the long run that kind of impartial objectivity can help them get other sources to talk and to when you also in front of the state institutions, especially in Serbia, where there is a lot of political polarization and the institutions are hostile to journalists. Also, a balance between going public and helping the victims is also really important. You should never go publicly without talking to the NGOs who are defending the victims, or the victims itself who are interviewed. And this disclaimer I wrote here on the PowerPoint presentation: you should not publish story if that is making the situation rather worse than better. Because sometimes it's not in the best interest of victims to go public. So you need to wait until they are ready to tell the story, and that can maybe benefit their case. Of course, there's a lot of ethical dilemmas when it comes to this kind of stories, because most of the sources are anonymous. And it's not recommended for journalists to use anonymous sources, but this kind of extreme cases such as human trafficking and forced labor, you need to do that. And not just it's ethical to do that because those victims are migrant workers are practically invisible for the system. Nobody is talking in their name. And also, in many cases in Serbia, it was shown that the law is practically not recognizing them at all. They're completely invisible for the system. Also, when you interview the victims, you should never pressure them. You should talk with them as long as they are comfortable with that. Also, as mentioned before, sometimes it's really hard to talk to foreign people. They don't speak the language, sometimes not even the English. So you're using translators or even Google Translate and everything. So you need to be really careful of what are they saying. That is why it's really important to combine documents, because when you combine documents, then you have something on paper, and even if you're sued for something, you can back that up. So use different sources as much as you can, and different documents in order to paint a picture. Also, when it comes to the ethical dilemma, I've always worked for the media, which are really professional, and I didn't have a problem with publishing fast sensational stories, but I had a problem when the editors didn't want to publish a story on time, but rather to wait. But sometimes for the people, it's really important to go, especially when they're on strike and when they're rebelling, which is really rare in these cases. You need to cover that because it's important for them. I had one case in 2017 of Turkish workers at the Belgrade waterfront project. That is a great, huge real estate project backed by the government and United Arab Emirates, really controversial in Serbia. So the workers, I found out accidentally on social media, on some Turkish group about the case, and went on the street to look out for them. So I found them accidentally on the street and entered the construction site with them. And they told me their story, how they're not being paid for months and how they're in the problem. So I even entered in a feud with the manager of the construction site. And but he eventually, after threatening to police to me for allegedly illegally entering the site, he admitted what is going on. So I did the story, and my editors were not really comfortable because of the big project and large business interests to go with the story immediately, but to wait the labor inspection. But for these people, that we waited for 2 days, but for these people, they needed the story going out immediately. And this is a story. It's not maybe in depth, but this is a story, or this is their story. And if they're ready publicly with their names to go out with the story, I think the media have a responsibility to publish that, because we're publishing official sources all the time. People are not given voice because it's not official. Case of Vietnam workers in Serbia is probably the biggest case of migrant exploitation and potential human trafficking, because it shows how the chain of exploitation and human trafficking goes from Vietnam to Serbia, and many companies are involved. Vietnam agencies, Chinese companies, several Chinese companies, but also the governments. Marija already told about it a bit, but I would just mention several things. The story was broke in November 2021 by media, who reported about a camp of Vietnamese workers and the bad conditions they're living in, but not in any form of details. And then Astra and another NGO dealing with this kind of issues, A11, visited the site and did a really detailed report on this, raising bigger awareness on the topic in the Serbian public. After that, another activist group entered the camp and took one of the workers outside on his demand, who was dissatisfied how they treated him. So after that, the story was big in the Serbian public. Everybody was talking about that, especially because the investor was the Chinese company, which is one of the reasons I think this story went big even in the international media. After some time, I did an investigation on this to properly examine the case, because Serbian government was saying that this is not any problem. They just live in bad conditions, but everything else is good. Their contracts are fine. They're legally in Serbia. But that was proven not correct at all. This is the first time I am approached by Vietnamese workers themselves. They approached me for the story. And also Astra and A11 was really helpful, and this was one of the best cooperations between media and NGOs, providing me with some of the victims, but mostly with documents, because I had an access to the victims, with exchanging the different documents, I sent them some contracts which were different, and the employer was the other company. They had the documents of some other company as their employer. So at the end, when I gathered all, I could paint a proper picture and to explain the whole chain from Vietnam to Serbia. It's important to tell the context for the people, because Serbian state is really servile to the foreign capital. It's really annoying, and the Serbian institutions are really not working. This is why work that Astra does and media also is really hard, because there is no any judicial outcome of the cases. I wanted to mention several really problematic documents which I found, but I think it's a bit not a part of our topic. But this case was also really there is no any outcome, but the only outcome, as told by Vietnamese workers to me, is that their conditions were improved after this media pressure. But there is no any the prosecution did nothing, despite the pressure from the European Parliament and the UN itself. So the efficiency is also important with these cases. When it comes to this kind of cases, I always work the fastest as I can, despite the sensitivity, because I think we need to work faster when it comes to these kind of stories, because people are every day in problem. Also, exploitation, example of Indian workers in Serbia is also one important example of the best comparison with the Astra actually. So this is the story that Astra find out about it and informed me as a journalist. And we practically went to the field to investigate together. So I think that the different role of the journalist and an NGO is important. So something that I can do on the field in order to obtain the information, they probably cannot. So when we went to that horrible place at the suburbs of Belgrade, we entered the site, and we conflicted with the security guard and everything, and even met the owner of the company, who was having the Indian workers in terrible conditions, really similarly like the Vietnamese workers. I obtained the illegal document and the list of workers being illegally financially punished during the interview with the owner without her knowledge, in a way which happened to be one of the best evidences later on, and when the whole scheme was discovered. And I had her comment on those documents to explain why does she doing that. So this case I would really emphasize as one of the best cooperations with the journalists and the NGOs, especially because you can see the trust between the organizations in order to, while the case is still alive, in order to work to put it in the public immediately. Also, it's also important when you have a good cooperation with journalists and NGOs, you can always have them as an authority on the topic and call them to help you understand some case. So these are the conclusions for the end. source sharing with confidentiality and total cooperation between what can and not be published, mutual fact-checking, not only facts but also ethics and legislation, and also the quickness. So, and this dual role, raising awareness and campaigning for solution, I think that is why the journalistic cooperation with NGOs are really important with these topics.
Thank you, Sasha. Thank you for your intervention. Thank you for sharing us your experience, especially on your investigations about human trafficking. Don't forget to the attendees and participants that you can share your questions with us in the box of questions, and also you can write them on the chat. Because then at the end we will be answering your remarks and questions. Okay, so now we will continue with our program, and we have now Lam Lee. She is an investigative journalist based in Hanoi, Vietnam. She goes beyond the headlines to examine long-lasting and overlooked impacts of unjust policies on marginalized groups. She won the ILO's 2020 Global Media Competition on labor migration and fair recruitment. Her work has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, The Guardian, Rest of World, the Sydney Morning Herald, Mekong Review, and others. So now, Lam, thank you for being with us. Maybe it's late for you now in Vietnam, but thank you for joining us. And now the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. So my name is Lam, and thank you for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me. So I will just be sharing some tips from like my experience reporting on human trafficking, forced labor, and similar issues. And since Sasha has done such a great job, like covering like the main themes, so my presentation is mainly on tips, basically, of what you can that I've gathered from my experience. So firstly, a little bit about what I've done, the stories I've done. So I've done stories about the Essex Lorry deaths that shocked like Britain and the rest of the world in 2019, when 39 Vietnamese were found dead at the back of a truck in Essex. So I had done stories about migrant workers in Taiwan and how they're being exploited, and also a story about surrogacy trade. So how basically women are being like smuggled, Vietnamese women are being smuggled to China to become surrogates. So these are like some of the relevant stories that I've done. Okay, so for the do's and don'ts, this is of course not an exhaustive list, and so these are just some selected do's and don'ts, thing that I can like share some background on. So the first thing is sources, it's one that I like to share is, for journalists, like don't ask other journalists for context of victims or survivors. So for example, for me, I've had like other journalists kind of like message me after reading like my story to ask whether I could share the contact of like some of the people I quoted in my stories. And often, always I have to say no, because I have to protect the victims and the survivors that I interviewed. So I think this is important to have in mind. So if you want to cover a story that someone else has covered it before, I think it's best to like find a new approach, and not to like basically feature one person again and again and again, because this is like because it risks turning that person into kind of like a trope for your story, and could re-traumatize people and affect their safety as well. And also, as the speakers at NGOs also said before, that it's often not a good idea to actually talk to survivors and victims because they could be re-traumatized. And that was that case when I covered the surrogacy trade from Vietnam to China. I was trying my best to independently find a Vietnamese surrogate who basically had delivered a baby in China for money, for sale, basically. But I was unsuccessful. So I turned to Blue Dragon, which is an NGO in Vietnam, and they specialize in a lot of things. Among them is rescuing victims of trafficking. And they've had rescued before Vietnamese surrogates. And Blue Dragon, they have a strict policy of not letting journalists talk to any of the survivors and victims that they have helped. And they issued like a very comprehensive like list why that is not acceptable for them. And I think I can share the link with you later. But one of the main reasons is basically we journalists are not therapists. And by talking to survivors of traumatic events, we can re-traumatize them. And that would basically be really harmful to them, to their mental health and general well-being. And as and because of that, instead of like Blue Dragon has offered me to share case studies of some of the victims that they had helped. And basically, in the story, it was basically presented as I included one of the case studies provided by Blue Dragon, clearly indicating in the story that I was not the person who interviewed the survivor, but it was Blue Dragon who gave me the information. And how can we trust this case studies if we don't interview victim ourselves? That's basically, you can cross-check this kind of story with, for example, stories from local media or like police reports and see patterns if they align. And you can cross-check with what your independent reporting, and you can cross-check with other NGOs who work in the same field as well, and cross-check with, for example, academic researchers, and to see if basically the story fits and is believable. And as long as you are transparent in the story that you weren't the person who actually interviewed the survivor, and then that's okay. So if, for example, you can't talk to the survivor or the victim, so what can you do? I mean, how can you find the subjects for a story? Because after all, as journalists, we need color for the story. We can't write a report with just numbers and hard facts. One way is to try to find returnees, so people who, for example, had been deported. So they had initially been, for example, trafficked overseas, and then they had been deported. And of course, find these returnees on your own and see if they are willing to help. And usually it's best to look for people who are kind of like have decided to become activists after basically victims who then decided to be activists. And you can find them because on social media, for example, or through like networks of like migrant workers. Another way to interview or to tell the story of victims of trafficking, for example, when they are dead, like in the case of the Essex Lorry deaths, is to, of course, interview family members and their friends and neighbors, religious communities that they're involved with. And also maybe some NGOs can be confident that like some survivors or some can be in a good enough mental state to talk to us, and that could be helpful. And so yeah, and I can tell you a bit an example about how neighbors were really helpful to me in one of my stories. So when I was in An province to basically talk to family members of the victims of the Essex Lorry deaths, on the first 2 days, most family members were willing to talk because they wanted the message to be out to the world, and they wanted to basically have the remains of their sons and daughters returned to Vietnam. But then, like by the third day, the family members were really tired, of course, because they had to. They're tired, and like also, they were not in a mentally healthy state to talk anymore to us. So by chance, a neighbor who was there and who knew the family well wanted to talk instead, and instead of talking about the specific case of specific victim, she talked more generally about the trend in her village, on how so many people actually live in the area to basically and pay smugglers to get to Europe illegally, and why they're doing it. So the story was meant to be about the 39 victims, but then by talking to other people, the neighbors who themselves have sons and daughters overseas, undocumented, working undocumented, you kind of like can show the bigger picture from like one incident. So that was one chance encounter, which kind of helped with my reporting. And also, but remember that whoever, with all these people that you talk to, you need consent, and it has to be informed consent. So it's important that before you talk to any survivors or victims, you have to explain to them exactly where the story is going to be published, in what language, and what risks it can entail, and how you can protect their identity and protect them from potential like any risks. So it's very important that that you do that before you start the interview, so that it's part of like to maintain trust. And of course, finding survivors of trafficking and forced labor is not easy. It can be a very difficult task. And so this picture is of one guy, and he used to grow cannabis in the UK. He's a Vietnamese, and he used to grow cannabis in the UK, and he basically had paid smugglers to get him to Britain. But then he was caught and he was deported back to Vietnam. So this story wasn't done by me, but I kind of like the journalist at AFP, basically we were just chatting with each other, and she's like, oh, by the way, I want to like find like Vietnamese returnees to talk to, and I was like, I mean, I was like, at the time I was like, oh, I'm not sure if that's going to help, but maybe it will go somewhere, because I used to study in England, and when I was there, I used to like translate for example, asylum seekers and people in detentions, Vietnamese people in detention. And so I connected the journalist with the person the Vietnamese person in England who runs this interpretation, the business. And that person then basically connected the journalist with another person and another person, because these people were basically already in the community of Vietnamese living in the UK. And from basically this person and the other person, it led to this guy that you see on this picture. And he actually wanted to talk to the media about his story, so that in his own words, so that then the Vietnamese people who actually want to pay smugglers to go to Britain illegally can have a full picture of what could happen if they do it. So could be as a way of warning, and so that they can be fully informed before they make this decision. And so when building trust with, how to build trust with subjects, and I think it's a difficult task, especially if you do it remotely by a computer, but then because it's COVID now, so you can't travel. But then at the same time, perhaps also doing it remotely can be good. I think having a good social media presence would be very helpful for potential subjects for you to interview, so that they can basically fact check you, whether you are an actual journalist or not. It would be good to have, for example, like a website. So I created a website for my own website where I have information in both English and Vietnamese. So while I write mostly for the English language media, I have like a page in Vietnamese, just for basically potential subjects to read through like my profile, so that they can, and like where they can find my contact number. So it's a way to like build trust. And like on my Facebook, for example, I share my stories, and this way basically they can see, oh, she's real. She's not like some person pretending to be her. And of course, collaboration with other journalists is really important, especially if it's about cross-country trafficking. And so it's good. It could be a one-person team, two-person team, three-person team. But it's always good to have someone on the ground. It's always good to have someone who speaks the language of the victims, so that you don't have to rely on Google Translate. But if you can't find a person, Google Translate can be very helpful as well. And someone who understands the context of the victims better, like if it's from the same country, for example. And also because we've been in quarantine for 2 years, and a lot of work was being done online. I realized that basically to find stories on this topic and to find people to talk to, it's good to have open source investigation techniques, OSINT, which these are kind of like different tricks on how to find the specific person you want to find on Facebook, on Twitter, on TikTok. And if you want to find these tips, if you just search for OSINT, you can find a lot of tips online for that. And by basically just using Facebook, for example, I managed to find mobile phone numbers of Vietnamese people, undocumented Vietnamese in like the UK. So through basically searching through Facebook groups and stuff, and because if you just message someone on Facebook, for example, then I think 80% chance they won't reply. But if you call them or message them via WhatsApp or like a different messaging app, then the likelihood that they respond will be higher. So I think, so I would highly recommend you check out these kind of tricks, open source investigation technique tricks to find. And also, I think most importantly, I think as the previous speakers also have mentioned, that don't focus just on how the trafficking happened. I know that it's the very exciting part, or like the part that basically sells, because it's like, oh, this is this underground network of how it happened. But it's also very important to give readers context of why it happened, how it began, and how it ended. And to give you an illustration why it could be eye-opening, it's like the picture on the left-hand side, for example, is the photo I took. It's basically the house of one of the Essex Lorry victims. So he lived in this, basically, you can see that how poor it is, right? So yeah, he was poor. But then the house on the big villa next to it, this is not a photo I took, but it's a photo from like Nean newspaper, is basically a house from the area where he lives. See, and these kind of villas are everywhere in the village that he lives. And the village that he lives is called Billionaire Village. And why it's called the Billionaire Village and why is it full of villas? That's because these people who live in these villas had actually paid smugglers to get to Europe, to work on cannabis farms, to work in nail salons, and they make big money and then send them back. And this is what is driving people from this area to keep coming to the UK, to Western Europe, despite the dangers. And once you have this kind of context, you have a new story, a new context, and you also, in this way, you humanize the people who are being smuggled, because you can understand the situation better, right? And also it is, while although I know that, for example, talking about laws and policies can sometimes be a bit dry, but when you look at this and how basically the process starts, how it happens, how it ends, and then step back and look at the bigger picture, you can connect then the dots, how, for example, policy in one country affects the migration, legal migration within another country. And one example would be here with the UK. For example, there are so many Vietnamese paying smugglers to get to UK to work in nail salons. Why do they do that? Because they can't do that legally. It's impossible, despite the fact that there is clear demand. People are recruiting Vietnam for nail salons, basically have a demand for people to paint their nail, for workers, right? But then, because the UK immigration system has these rules which say that you can only get a work visa if you make at least this amount of money a year, and it's a really high amount of really high level of salary, which no basically nail salon worker would have. So it's impossible for them to migrate legally, so they have to do it illegally. So from one event, there are different ways to basically expand the topic, and maybe the issues from first may not seem as exciting as the trafficking route, but actually if you dig deeper and connect the dots, and I think you can also make an equally exciting story. So I think that's all from me, and thank you.
Thank you, Lam. Thank you so much for your intervention, your presentation, and for sharing us your experience reporting about human trafficking. And now we will proceed to go to the questions that the attendees have shared with us. And then also we will have Suzanne Hoff, who will be answering some of the questions as well. And at the same time, she will be presenting her intervention, but we will do it through the questions because there are questions that are related with what she is supposed to say. So let's go for the first one that I have here, that it's for everyone. So maybe the one that feels more prepared can answer. The first question that we have is, do you see a role for local NGOs, social welfare organizations that work on a regional level to engage in partnerships with journalists? And if so, how might that partnership differ from NGOs that work on a national or international level? Maybe Marija, you can answer this one.
Yes, well, we already have partnerships on the regional and I can say even worldwide level, but informal, between NGOs and journalists. We don't have some formal, it's mostly, but the problem is this partnership is ad hoc. It depends on the certain case that pop up, you know, like in Linglong case and so on. So we cooperated also with journalists from other countries about these and similar cases, but it would be good to have, you know, long-term sustainable cooperation and to build this trust, and not only about the particular case that pop up, but also think about some future common actions and so on. And it would be good also for those who support the projects. For example, European Commission, one of our biggest donors, to think about these common calls, because for now you have calls for journalists and calls for NGOs, you know, but it's also important to build this partnership. And I think then it could be very productive and effective for the future.
Great. Maybe Susan, you can also elaborate on this question.
Oh, difficult question. I think it should be done at every level. So either if you're a local NGO, of course, you work more with the local media. And then it's very important that people in your village or at your local level know you, and that you also, because of course for NGOs could also be to get more awareness for you. So partly we use, for example, the media for visibility reasons, but also if you, for example, let's say you're a very small local NGO and you don't get money anymore, we've also seen that the media can help you maybe to raise awareness that you do a good job or that you need money. And then, of course, it depends very much. The higher, on the higher level you cooperate, your media strategy will be different. But of course, and yeah, that's also what I was thinking to say. Of course, it depends very much what's your need for the media. Media can do harm as well. I think some of the people already said this. So you have to be very careful why you need the media and what's the best strategy.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Susanne. And now we have a question for the journalists, for Sasha and Lam. Lam can start answering. I'm gonna read the question and it says, having in mind that massive cases of trafficking for the purpose of labor exploitation are usually cases of organized crime involving state actors very often, how they are taking care about their safety? So how you are taking care of your safety? Have they been exposed to any kind of threats or situations when their safety was endangered? Having that in mind, does it lead sometimes to auto censorship? Maybe Lam, you can start with this question.
Personally, I haven't received any threats regarding this. Probably because the stories that I wrote for don't, although they do mention failures from the government side, these usually present basically facts that the government itself has admitted. So basically so I quote the government on its own, mishandlings, if the government's mentioned. And also, I think also the fact that I also self-censor myself as well is a way for me to protect myself. So for example, if the story criticizes the recruitment agencies who recruit the workers and then they basically traffic them overseas, I mean, that's fine. I mean, because it's not seen by the government as the direct threat to the government. So so basically, I know that so this is kind of a compromise I have to make, that sometimes I can't tell the full 100% of the story because I'm an independent journalist and I don't have like an institutional backing for me to basically keep me safe and my family safe. So that's the compromise I have to make, unfortunately, sometimes.
And Sasha, maybe talking about the safety of the victims as well, how did you see that victims are taking care about their own safety? How did you see that even though they are exposed to this kind of threats from organized crime, how do you see that their safety has been endangered?
Well, when I'm in contact with the victims, I'm usually using different kind of apps. So I'm preferring Signal as an app, but I'm sometimes using other apps as well because of some people are using other. So for example, when I did the Vietnamese worker story, I used Zalo because they used Zalo. And also I met in person with them. So yeah, those are the ways I'm trying to, you know, contact with them so we can keep our protection. Also, I can see from when I talk to them, I see what can be dangerous for them or not, or they tell me, I ask them. So yeah, those are the ways basically how I'm communicating with the sources in that regards. I can also answer on the previous question if you'd like. So in Serbia, the political situation is a bit complex. So the Serbian government is completely dominating the whole political spectrum, and they are now in the phase of ignoring. So especially because the independent media outlets such as BIRN or Insider or Krik or some other, because they're funded mostly by projects, and they have a international respect for the professionalism they're doing. So if they would attack me or the organization, they avoid that unless it's something really, really, you know, directly problematic for them. So in this case, they basically trying to ignore the case or to downplay it. So I didn't have threats by the government officials or institutions or something like that. They just trying to hide the information from us. They completely ignore our freedom of information requests. Like I can only get that from some sources from the institutions which are talking to me unofficially. But I had problems when I did some of the forced labor stories on the ground. When I went to the field to investigate, I mentioned the case of Turkish workers where I was practically being almost physically attacked by the manager of the construction site, and the Turkish workers were like trying to prevent him to do that because they were afraid he will take my videotape I filmed, and there were nothing going to be with the story. But I avoided the physical contact, and he threatened me with the police, and I was not going to back down, and eventually he gave me the statement which I needed to have a complete story and to have other side. So also when we did the story on the Indian workers, we had Astra colleagues and me when we went there. We also had a problem with the security guy, but that wasn't escalated to any kind of physical contact. And after us being pushy and not backing down, we had our goal to meet with the owner of the company who brought the Indian workers in Serbia. So those are the problems I had, but on big political scale, they are avoiding that, and they are too powerful at this point. But I think that will change in several years, definitely.
Thank you, Sasha. Now we will go to the next question that maybe it's also based on the collaboration that Astra together with journalists had. And it says, from an NGO perspective, how should we approach to journalists? And from a journalistic perspective, how should journalists approach to NGOs? Maybe Marija can start, and then Sasha and also Lam, and well, I think everyone, but maybe this one was very focused on the collaboration that Sasha had and his colleague with Astra. So Marija, you can start.
Well, yes, I think the networking and collaboration is necessary and important. It's definitely we have different angles, like Sasha said, of work and different scope, and that's okay, different aims of our work, but we also have some common needs, NGOs and journalists. And I think that NGOs need to be accessible for the journalists and provide them with relevant and relevant information and maybe even double-checked information. But also, as someone from the NGO, I can say that we are very cautious when we cooperate with journalists with whom we cooperate. We don't cooperate with all journalists. Of course, we publish press releases and send to all journalists, but we will not so easily give every information to any journalist, So what we need to see is minimum of ethical codex and standards to be implemented by the journalists and media in order to cooperate, particularly if we talk about direct involvement of the victim. And there was also a question I saw about is it really necessary to have victim interviewed for the story? Actually, and I can only give you one example of a case that we had about a girl who was trafficked from Serbia from a very vulnerable population to Western European country, and we couldn't do anything about the case. Even all institutions were involved and knew about the case. We didn't have any reactions. So we were so desperate that we called journalists, and it was Miloš Teodorovic from Free Europe Radio and Radio Free Europe, and he actually made a story without interviewing a victim, completely without interviewing, but interviewing all the institutions involved in the case, like Ministry of Social Affairs, social worker, Ministry of Interior, local police, also Center for Victims, and then also institutions in the Western European country. And he made a story, he made a whole story around the victim without interviewing a victim, but he got information from us, about the case, and he was awarded for that story later. So I think it is possible. Like in the court case, when we say to prosecutors, don't rely only on the victim story, you need to have other evidence, because maybe the victim will not be in position to come to the court or to tell the true story because of the fear, because of the frightened, of the threats, of everything.
Thank you, Marija. Sasha, maybe you can also answer this question: how do journalists how can journalists, or how should journalists approach NGOs?
Yeah, well, as I mentioned in the presentation, and Maria said, it's really hard to trust with this kind of cases where the victims are involved, and also where not many actors in the field are ethical at all. So I don't really trust many NGOs, and NGOs do not trust many journalists, which is really understandable, because I don't trust most of the journalists at all. So as I said, I think if you're working in this kind of fields and with this kind of topic, the people in the NGO can see that you're someone who is not doing this for the clicks, because you're really into the topic, and you're believing in what are you doing. And also when you see that some NGOs are doing their great work, giving concrete informations and not just some brochures just to spend money, you can see who is doing the proper job. So when you recognize those two, it's really easy to start communicating. And when you start to do one case together, you see that everybody did their best, and then with time you create that kind of cooperation and relation for the long term. So I think just do the professional work, and similar people, common people in the field will recognize that.
Thank you, Sasha. So now we will go for the next question that is for all the panelists. Maybe we can start with Susan, then Lam can answer as well. And it says, all of you have mentioned to some degree the importance of media coverage in raising awareness among potential migrants so they could avoid from falling for certain exploitative practices, conditions as the victims, survivors in question. However, there is a target audience for each coverage outlet. If you are writing in English or your work is in a foreign language, how are you going to achieve this goal among people who don't speak this language, like non-English speaking Vietnamese people? Maybe Lam can start and then Susan can elaborate a bit more.
Yes, okay. So yeah, while most of my work is in English, I usually aim to publish at like well-known publications, and I usually prefer to get these stories published in publications that don't have a paywall. For this kind of stories to publish in basically outlets that don't have a paywall, and that are big enough for basically for Vietnamese media to pick them up and translate them, or like do secondary reporting. So this could so this is one way. For example, like the one recent investigation published in December that I did with several other journalists. That was basically a bit of a follow-up to Sasa's story. Was basically translated by one of the Vietnamese outlets, and also was translated into Vietnamese by this website of Vietnamese in Germany. So so that Vietnamese migrants in Germany could read it. So even if my work is mostly in English, I think it can still reach non-English speaking Vietnamese audience. And also by publishing in foreign media, I am less bound by censorship, and I can basically touch on like the more sensitive aspects of the issue.
Thank you, Lam. Susanne?
Yeah, it's a difficult question. I would say on one hand, and if you allow me, I will raise some points also differently that I was initially planning to make, but I will be very short. I think it's very difficult. I think, of course, the media are there to inform people, not only migrants, but of course, that's also a major role. Of course, nowadays, we also see that migrants use a lot of other opportunities. They use social media and a large diversity of media sources. We also see, and that's a bit of a risk, that a lot of things are also not, and I think some speakers already said it, are not correct. So it can also raise stigmas. For example, there was a question I saw about Ukraine. And for the last 4 or 5 weeks, of course, we have been closely following the situation in Ukraine. And a lot of Ukrainians you also see are informing themselves. I was visiting Poland, for example, 1 week ago, and we were at the Warsaw station. And then we heard that a lot of people were actually doubtful if they should register, and still large groups of people have not registered for the temporary protection. It's also because they fear that they cannot return back to Ukraine, that they're not allowed to travel. Some people say maybe we can never leave. Some people say if we register, you will be like with the Dublin returns. So you also see that people are not necessarily always good informed. And I'm not saying that this is only the case of the media informing them badly. But of course, what you also see nowadays, there's so much information out there. There's the information from the official channels. There's all this information from the media, and they're not necessarily online. So sometimes all this overflux of information is also raising sometimes panic, or people not to trust information anymore, and also creating misinformation, which we in particular now see with the war in Russia. People in Russia get completely opposite information from people in Ukraine. And also we also have to question ourselves, is all the information we get from Ukraine all true? And that's very difficult also for us as NGOs, but also especially for the media to check. I just wanted to raise a couple of more issues, but I will be very short. I know it's difficult and we'll be running out of time. What we saw again with the media in Ukraine, we got really loads of calls, even high-level media representatives from CNN, BBC, name the source, and they were calling us because there was a large attention related to Ukraine about human trafficking. Someone asked already in the chat, Do you have evidence? There's very, very little evidence at the moment about trafficking to happen. We have got 7 cases of possible people, potential trafficked persons that were referred to us. And that's at the moment what we see. There are a lot of signals. There's also issues that the police takes up and tries to investigate. But what's the real evidence? It's still very difficult to know. Of course, you also all heard about the stories about rape and sexual violence. We're also trying to collect that and to monitor that on the ground. We have a member in Ukraine. We are trying to monitor it, and we have at the moment 12 reports of rapes. And luckily, there are also very trustworthy organizations like Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, who are long on the ground, that of course media can make use of. So quickly about that. Then secondly, about what we saw again with Ukraine, it was always time to shock. I really like the example that Marija just gave, that you don't necessarily need to interview the person, but still completely portray the story and see it from different angles. And I would like to recommend to the media representatives online here, please try to do it. I'm 20 years in the field, and I have hardly ever read a very nice story about the background, the fields. There's a lot happening in the anti-trafficking field, and I know that maybe the general public is not always so interested in that, but do realize that a lot of people working in anti-trafficking also read the media and also want to learn more. And there could be very interesting stories. For example, there was once a UN special representative, rapporteur, the first one on trafficking. She was arrested in Belarus. And there was absolutely silence. I think it would have been interesting if some media were then raising attention. We also hear sometimes other stories, things that are happening in the field, and never ever the media is questioning, why is this person so long in the field? Is this rapporteur doing his or her job correctly? Is the European Commission doing enough on human trafficking? You very often see that on those kind of issues, media is repeating a little bit what the actors say themselves. So I would like to have a more critical voice there from the journalists, because we can also use it. So avoid the stereotypes. Also traffickers, of course, it's an ethical issue sometimes. Actually today, the Global Alliance has launched a publication on who are the traffickers. And it's very difficult also for us, because are you a trafficker when you are prosecuted for human trafficking? That still doesn't really make sure that you are more a victim or more a criminal, than the one who is not prosecuted. We also see that a lot of individuals, of course, have been exploiting people, not necessarily only criminal groups. But what we also see is that, for example, if you talk about smuggling cases, and I heard the example of Essex, there was also a lot of that the taxi drivers, for example, who are now prosecuted for smuggling the migrants, were also saying we are victims ourselves. And that's actually, of course, also sometimes a dilemma. But what we see at the moment, and PICAM is very active on that, is that a lot of people who are now prosecuted for smuggling are actually individuals who try to help their people, are actually NGOs. So it's also very important that the media are reporting about that. And then maybe lastly, a few comments on the recommendations. Trust was mentioned. I think for us, it's very important, and I understand that maybe you don't trust the NGOs, or the NGOs do not trust the journalists. I think for all of us, it is very important that we establish longer-term relationship. I always ask, if a journalist quotes me, can you please send it? Not all the media does it, but if you do, you have much more chance that we will work again with you, that we share certain information earlier with you, and that you can also profit from it. So I would really advise journalists to really build a good trust relationship with the NGOs. And last, but it's said already, really check your facts. I see it very often in the media and also in the news, quotes which are actually not true or not based on evidence. And it's also very, very important that you know who says it. Because if someone, for example, claims that most people are trafficked for sexual exploitation, you have to know if what this person is personal opinion on prostitution, for example. So you really always have to frame it a little bit and not automatically always believe it. Every year there is a sports events. We hear that thousands of women are trafficked for sexual exploitation. We hear it now. We don't have many cases yet at the moment. So I think you really, not only media, but also us, we all have to ensure that the evidence we have and the information that's out there is correct, is evidence-based, in order to really make a change. Because for us, it can also do quite harm if the media say other things, while we are trying to actually reduce stigmas and misinformation in the field. That's what I wanted to share. And sorry, I had to be very quick, but it's quite interesting to listen to everyone.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Suzanne, and thank you to all the speakers today. Well, I just shared with you the link. Well, I shared it some minutes ago, the link for the survey, so you can let us know how did you see this webinar, how did you feel it, and what if your expectations were fulfilled with it. And of course, we want to know if you have other suggestions to organize another webinars or sessions in the coming months. If you didn't receive it, and maybe for the people who are connected online, maybe people who will see it later on, you can scan this QR code and then you can go to the survey. So thank you everyone. That's all that we have for today. And thank you for joining our panelists to discuss about human trafficking. We really appreciate that you have signed in, and we really hope that you have learned useful tips to continue investigating on this topic. Before we sign off, I will also like to tell you about our Modern Slavery Grant Program. The deadline is on 15th of September, and feel free to reach out to me if you want to apply. If you want more information about it, we can help you, and we can organize pre-application advice meetings if you want. Okay, so thank you everyone for joining today. Thank you to our speakers, and we hope to see you next time. Thank you. Bye.